We have been looking at Streeck's five disorders of capitalism, and we looked at the first one, that is stagnation, and we didn't start considering the second one, but sort of did a preamble for that. So today we are going to start looking at the second and hopefully maybe the third one as well. So the five disorders of the capitalism today, according to Streeck's stagnation. Second is oligarchic distribution. Third is plundering of the public domain. And the fourth is corruption. And the fifth one is global anarchy. So the second and the third one. So turning to the second disorder, there is no indication that the long-term trends toward greater economic inequality will be broken anytime soon, or indeed ever. So inequality in obviously in one sense the part and parcel of capitalism, the logic of capitalism. Why? Because and obviously when we are talking about inequality, we're talking about relative. And that's because accumulation requires concentration. And concentration means inequality of certain extent, because unlike some people have concentration, more money, there won't be any. Than others, there won't be any concentration. And if concentration is required for accumulation, then obviously you need relative inequality, and it's all the time. So relative inequality is actually the condition of the existence of capitalism in that sense. But because concentration means that some people would have more money than others. Concentration. But that doesn't mean that other people sort of anybody, because also part of concentration or part of accumulation that people have, if your concentration is through supply and demand, that's the mechanism, then people must have, buying power. Otherwise, the whole process of accumulation will halt. But so yeah, and ideally the tendency in capitalism is towards, and that's the logic of concentration, is towards monopoly. Because if concentration is absolute, then the logical result would be monopoly of concentration. But you also require competition in order, so as a mechanism to fuel the let's say the urge, or I guess urge or desire to accumulate. So competition is important. So the competition required that you don't have monopolies. So the logic of concentration require that there would be monopoly, not just monopolies, but actually at the end. And that's why socialism, which is more concerned with accumulation, oddly enough, leads to monopoly, like the state monopoly, because it reckons that the best way to accumulate is through absolute concentration, but it ignores the competition part, which is also very important, because the desire, you need competition because the desire to accumulate is not natural. Most people, especially for its own sake, it's not natural. You have to actually fuel it, and the mechanism through which you fuel it is competition. So mature capitalism settles on a formula. Formula of, so what you have is not just you have monopolies, in most sectors you have monopolies, but so you have a few monopolies, 4, 5, 6, depending on the sector, and there's a competition between them. So you settle on not the classical competition with you, free competition between a lot of free firms, but the competition which you call oligopolistic, I think, not sure, holistic competition. You can check the spelling. Actually having a bit of ruddy nose to avoid, might not be working very well. Oligopolistic competition is the competition between, depending on the sector, a few large companies or corporations, etc. So that's how you settle this dialectic or the contradiction between the requirements of accumulation, requirements of concentration, and the requirements of fueling the desire for accumulation, which is competition. So oligopolistic capitalism engenders obviously inequality is by definition. Or what Germans call the I love this word, Ungleichheit. Gleichheit. I don't know whether there's another H or not. Ungleichheit. So inequality is there, but it is a relative inequality, and in the centers of mature capitalism, people, despite this inequality, they live fairly comfortable life, especially in when the concept when the focus is on production, or so the production capitalism, or when the production sector is dominant, because you need good buying power to accumulate. There is a redistribution. You have high wages, you have low employment, relatively, all things are relative. And those people who are not employed, you have welfare state. But as capitalism moved from production to finance, the buying power, so concentration becomes huge. So that means that inequality goes up as well. And in finance, you don't need that sort of buying power for everybody. You just need, maybe upper 2%, and then overall 10% of people have most of the money, and the rest of 90%, get the leftover. So that increase the inequality. And that's one of the characteristics of financial capitalism. That inequality increases and the wealth get concentrated more and more in upper 10%, and even among upper 10% you have upper 2%, and even upper 2% you have 1%, and eventually the most of the wealth goes to point fraction of that upper 1%, and the 90% get what is left over. And that obviously creates all sorts of problems for societies in terms of legitimation, in terms of politics. So let's go back. So turning to the second episode, there's no indication that the long-term trend towards greater economic inequality will be broken anytime soon, or indeed ever. Inequality depresses growth, especially in the production sector, for Keynesian and other reasons. But the easy money currently provided by central banks to restore growth, easy for capital, but not, of course, for labor. Well, it depends on what type of labor, because Streeck is big on the capital labor distinction in the Marxist socialist tradition. But this distinction become obsolete as capitalism moves toward financial capital, and even before, because labor is also capital. So the easy money which is coming to capital is also going to labor, but it depends on which type of labor is involved in accumulation at the time. So in financial capital, that money goes to managers and CEOs. They are all labors too. I mean, in fact, one of the characteristics of capitalism is that as capital becomes mature and as it moves toward financial capital, everybody is the subject of capital. Nobody is actually the owner, and the distinction between, or the separation between, ownership and management becomes very crucial. And those who are running the show are managers, and managers are eventually, they are not the owners, so they are eventually labor as well. So there's no absolute distinction between labor and capital. That's why you talk about human capital. It depends on who has the capacity to accumulate, and like those who have capacity to accumulate in a specific type of capitalism, they are capital, and they get the rewards, and they get a lot of accumulation because they can accumulate, so they get the reward. But the rest of the population, which is either incapable or unwilling to dedicate themselves to that system, they are the losers. They only get the leftovers. So that's the thing. But the easy money currently provided by central banks to restore growth, easy for capital but not, of course, for labor, further adds to inequality by blowing up the financial sector and inviting speculative rather than productive investment. So as we saw last time, the money which is pumped into the economy after crises, for example, that doesn't fuel growth in the productive sector. Mostly goes back to financial sector, because financial sector is the dominant sector politically and economically. So it doesn't really fuel the growth in productive sector. It doesn't generate redistributive forces which are related to production sector. So redistribution becomes oligarchic. It becomes more and more money goes to upper 10 and upper 2 and upper 1 and fraction of the upper 1%. So redistribution to the top thus becomes oligarchy. Rather than serving as a collective interest in economic progress, as promised by neoclassical economics, it turns into extraction of resources from increasingly impoverished, declining societies. A redistribution to the top thus becomes oligarchy. in this context, rather than serving a collective interest in economic progress as promised by neoclassical economics. It turns into extraction of resources from increasingly impoverished, declining societies. In a sense, this has always been the case. It's just that over time it moves around and different. So if you take the example of England, for example, the first, basically where the capitalism really started, you see the plunder started with, around 15th century through the reappropriation of commons, plunder of Catholic lands and monasteries and their wealth, and then through the commercialization of agriculture sector and the decline of feudalism, large peasant populations were forced to move to cities, and they were used as a cheap labor in awful conditions, generally, to become the fodder for the emerging capitalism, the production-based capitalism, the sort of scenario you will come across in Charles Dickens' novels, for example. But over time, capitalism moves to, or starting to move to colonialism. And some of those peasant populations were diverted to army. And the unprecedented 200 years of plunder as a result of colonialism, so much wealth was accumulated that in the heart of capitalist societies, it was possible to redistribute some of the wealth to the population in general, and their standard of living started rising. But the rise in the standard of living is always at the expense of some other population, some extraction from some other resources. And when this saturates and we enter into the era of financial capitalism, even then, the ex-colonial lands or third world is still the main arena of plunder and extraction. But that's not enough for capitalism today, because when it saturates, it doesn't have too many other arenas to exploit and to plunder and to. That's the logic of concentration. The rates of returns fall, and that capitalism can't. That's why it moves from one sector to another, one area to another, and that's why So when that concentrates, then the plunder and extraction returns to the mainlands of capitalism, so to speak. And obviously it starts from the fringes of society, start from the very poor or immigrants or minority population, but it spreads to other poor population of the mainstream populations of the mature capitalist or advanced, so-called advanced capitalist countries. So it's not as if, and that's one of the shortcomings of Streeck's analysis, because his position is sort of a nationalistic capitalist. So he largely ignores the colonial background or imperialistic background of capitalism. That's why, at least in this analysis, at times it seems that you had a welfare capitalism in 60s to 80s, 45 to 80 roughly, and then now, and that was a good thing, and now you financial capital that has broken down or in the process of breaking down, and that's not good. That's true, but it's not as if this didn't require or didn't entail extraction of resources from some other and plundering from some other areas. So that part doesn't come across in his analysis. So redistribution job thus becomes oligarchic. Rather than serving a collective interest in economic progress, as promised by neoclassical economics, it turns into extraction of resources from increasingly impoverished, declining societies. So, and that starts from the fringes of capitalism, but it moves to the mainland, and within mainland it started from fringes and then moved to the center. So countries that come to mind here are Russia, Ukraine, but also Greece and Spain, and increasingly the United States. So United States is the heartland of capitalism, but also has large minority populations and immigrant population, unlike other mature capitalist countries. So you can see that, and obviously it's more advanced capitalist country. So you can see the extractions of resources and concentration, inequality, which has come about as a result of financialization more starkly. And obviously is clear in less developed advanced countries like Spain, or developing countries like Greece, Ukraine, and Russia. So under oligarchic redistribution, the Keynesian bond which tied the profits of the rich to the wages of poor is severed. So in production dominated capitalism, you had high wages and welfare or whatnot, and that was the bond, cutting the fate of economic elites loose from that of masses. So that's the second disorder of capitalism. So capitalism doesn't have mass support, or it might lose mass support, which it gathered within mature economies during the production-based capitalism or welfare capitalism. Okay, so I think we'll stop here, and we'll start with the third disorder next time.